14-year-old girl frantically begged a reclusive millionaire for help deep in the woods. In her arms, she held a newborn baby. Minutes later, a group of pursuers arrived, leaving them no time to escape. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing through the trees and swirling the snow into a suffocating white abyss. Charlotte Miller pushed forward, legs numb, arms trembling, the baby wrapped in her coat, barely stirring. Each step through the knee-deep snow felt like trudging through wet cement, her breath burning in her lungs, but stopping wasn't an option. Stopping meant death for both of them. The baby whimpered, a weak sound swallowed instantly by the storm. Charlotte tightened her grip, pressing the small body against her chest, trying to shield him from the icy wind. Her fingers, raw and cracked, had lost all feeling long ago. Behind her, the trees groaned under the weight of ice. But there was something else. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A crunch, a shift in the snow. Charlotte didn't look back. She couldn't. Her father's voice echoed in her head, his last breath ragged and desperate. "Don't let them find him." And then the gunshot, the wet gurgle as he hit the floor. She shook the memory away. It didn't matter now. The only thing that mattered was keeping the baby safe. Up ahead, through the flurry of snow, something flickered. A light. Weak, barely visible, but real. A cabin. Charlotte forced her legs to move faster, stumbling forward. Her boots caught on something, a buried root maybe, but she barely felt the impact as she hit the ground. Snow filled her mouth, her nose. The baby let out a tiny, choked cry. Charlotte pushed up, her body screaming in protest. The cold had settled deep in her bones, dragging her down like lead weights. She was so close. She could hear the wind battering against the cabin walls, see the faint glow of firelight through a frost-covered window. Another sound, closer this time. They were coming. Panic surged through her, giving her just enough strength to drag herself the last few feet. A remote cabin, buried deep in the woods. Firelight flickered inside, stretching long, wavering shadows across the walls, their movements uneasy, restless, like ghosts lingering in the corners. Ethan Calloway sat in his worn leather chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The storm howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the world was quiet, controlled, just the way he wanted it. Then a pounding at the door. He froze. No one should be here. The knocking came again, frantic, desperate. Ethan stood, his mind already calculating possibilities. A lost hiker? A trap? He moved toward the door, every step deliberate. Years of instinct whispered, "Don't open it." But he did. The girl collapsed into him the second the door swung open. Thin, half-frozen, her face streaked with snow and exhaustion. Her arms locked around a bundled-up baby, small and unmoving. Ethan caught her before she hit the ground. The girl's lips parted, breathless. "Please," she gasped, "help me." The baby stirred, barely. Ethan hesitated. The weight in his arms was featherlight, fragile. He could see the exhaustion in the girl's eyes, the way her fingers gripped his coat with the last of her strength. Then she whispered the words that made his stomach twist. "They're coming." Ethan's head snapped up. Movement. Just beyond the tree line, dark figures shifting between the skeletal branches. His grip on the girl tightened. Shit. Decision time. If he turned them away, he wouldn't get involved, wouldn't be dragged back into a world he'd walked away from years ago. But the baby whimpered, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't turn away. He pulled her inside, kicked the door shut, and bolted it. Charlotte barely registered the heat of the cabin. The warmth should have burned after so many hours in the cold, but her body was beyond sensation. She swayed on her feet, muscles locking in exhaustion. But there was no time for weakness. She forced herself to stay upright as Ethan dragged a chair over and eased her into it. The baby lay wrapped in the crook of her arm, far too still. "Keep him warm," she croaked. Ethan crouched in front of her, his expression unreadable. The kind of face that had learned how to show nothing. "You're freezing," he said, like it was an observation, not a concern. Charlotte's fingers clenched tighter around Noah. "Please," she managed. "He's worse." Ethan pulled a thick wool blanket from the couch and wrapped it around the baby. He pressed the back of his hand to Noah's tiny chest, feeling for movement, faint but still there. Charlotte exhaled shakily. "Who were you running from?" Ethan asked. She flinched. Not because she didn't want to answer, but because she didn't know if she could trust him. She swallowed. "Men, armed. They killed my father." Ethan didn't react, didn't blink, like he had heard worse. Charlotte's vision blurred for a second, her body swaying again. Ethan's voice cut through the haze. "When?" She forced herself to focus. 2 hours ago. Something flickered across his face, recognition. Ethan wasn't just anyone. He had spent his life in a world of money and power. Such people must be hunting them down, and if these people were after the child, that meant they hadn't finished the job. He shifted his gaze back to the baby. "Who is he?" His voice was low, controlled, too controlled. Charlotte hesitated, her fingers twitching against the fabric of her coat. She licked her lips, her voice coming out hoarse. "Noah Blackwell." The name landed like a weight in the room. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. He leaned back slightly, gripping his knee. "Blackwell. Of course," Charlotte exhaled slowly. "His father was William Blackwell." Ethan already knew where this was going, but he didn't interrupt. Charlotte swallowed hard. 2 weeks ago, he was assassinated. Ethan glanced at the child again. The only surviving heir. That explained everything. Why she was running, why people were hunting them. His eyes flicked back to Charlotte. "Who sent the kill order?" She clenched her jaw. "If I knew that, I wouldn't be here." Ethan studied her. She was a mess pail, exhausted, half frozen, but her voice was steady. She wasn't just a scared girl running for her life. "And you?" he asked. She hesitated again, her shoulders tensing before she spoke. "My father was the Blackwell family's head of security." Her voice caught slightly on the last word. "He died trying to get Noah out." Ethan exhaled through his nose. That explained the discipline, the way she carried herself, even when terrified. Charlotte looked away, her throat working as she swallowed. "He told me to run, told me not to let them find Noah, and then..." She stopped, the unspoken ending heavy in the air. Ethan didn't press. He didn't need to. For a long moment, neither spoke. The cabin's warmth was shattered by the looming threat outside. Ethan's grip on the rifle tightened as he listened, voices low, measured, the kind that belonged to men who didn't panic. They were circling, waiting. Charlotte barely breathed, pressing Noah closer to her chest. The baby whimpered, a small, fragile sound, but in the suffocating silence it was deafening. The doorknob twitched. Ethan moved fast, no hesitation. He grabbed Charlotte's arm, pulling her toward the floorboards near the fireplace. She stumbled but followed, instinct overriding fear. The latch was old, stiff from years of neglect, but Ethan wrenched it open, revealing a dark crawl space beneath the cabin. Not much room, barely enough for the three of them, but it had to be enough. Footsteps on the porch. He shoved Charlotte and Noah inside, climbing in after them just as the door swung open. The floor above creaked under heavy boots. 5, maybe 6 men. Ethan could hear the way they moved, deliberate, controlled, professional. A voice, low, cold, calculating. "Find the baby." Charlotte's breath hitched. Ethan pressed a hand against her arm, a warning, "Stay still." Boots scraped across the wooden floor. Shadows flickered through the cracks in the floorboards. One of them stood directly above. A long pause, a breath of silence, then footsteps retreating. The door creaked shut. They didn't leave. The wind outside carried their muffled voices. They were waiting, watching. Ethan exhaled slowly. No more time. He shifted, silently lifting the trapdoor just enough to check the room. Empty. But that wouldn't last. He turned to Charlotte, speaking so low it was barely audible. "We move now." She nodded. They slipped out the back door into the snow-covered trees where he had hidden his long-disused car and disappeared into the storm. Snow-covered roads stretched endlessly before them, the truck groaning under the strain of speed. Headlights carved a narrow path through the blizzard, but beyond that, the world was a dark, frozen abyss. Inside, the air was thick with something heavier than the cold. Charlotte sat rigid in the passenger seat, arms wrapped tightly around Noah, her knuckles white from gripping the fabric of his blanket. The baby stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Too weak, too fragile. Ethan's hands were steady on the wheel, but his jaw was tight. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, scanning the empty road behind them. They hadn't seen the men since the cabin. That didn't mean they weren't still being hunted. Tension coiled in the silence between them. Ethan broke it first. "Why risk your life for a kid that isn't yours?" Charlotte exhaled, the weight of the question pressing down on her. She stared out the window, watching the trees blur past in the darkness. "My father believed in something bigger than money," she said finally. Ethan didn't respond right away. The words sat heavy between them. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "And where did that belief get him?" Charlotte turned, meeting his eyes in the dim light of the dashboard. "Dead." Neither spoke after that. The truck rumbled over a patch of ice, skidding slightly before Ethan corrected the wheel. He exhaled sharply, muttering something under his breath. Then he shifted the subject. "I know a guy, Nathan Monroe, ex-federal agent, now off-grid. If anyone can make us disappear, it's him." Charlotte didn't trust easily, but she had no better option. She nodded once. "Where?" "Few hours south." Noah stirred again. Charlotte adjusted his blanket, tucking him in tighter. The fuel gauge ticked lower. They pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of a forgotten town. Dim lights flickered under the awning, casting long, stretched-out shadows across the pavement. Snow had begun to fall heavier, covering everything in a thick layer of white, obscuring what little visibility the night had offered. The wind howled across the empty highway, a chilling reminder of the isolation. Ethan slammed the truck into the gravel lot, the tires skidding slightly as he braked. He didn't stop for a second. As soon as the engine was off, he looked out the rearview mirror. The black SUV that had been tailing them for miles was still there, parked at the far end of the station. Charlotte shifted beside him, clutching Noah, her knuckles white from the tight grip she had on him. She was silent, but her body was taut with tension. She felt it too. They were being hunted. "Stay low," Ethan muttered, his voice steady but his eyes calculating. He took a deep breath, trying to mask the growing unease. "We'll just grab a few things, then get back on the road." Charlotte nodded, but her heart was pounding. She didn't trust him entirely, not yet, but she had no choice. He was the only one who had been there when they needed help, even if it was just for the moment. She grabbed the bag at her feet, reaching for her coat. Her fingers brushed against the baby's cheek to check if he was still breathing, still alive, still holding on. The truck door creaked as Ethan opened it, stepping out and scanning the gas station quickly. He didn't make a move yet, just observed, sensing the looming danger. Charlotte followed him out but kept her head down, her eyes flicking between the SUV and the narrow alley between the gas station's walls. A man stepped out of the SUV. He was tall, wearing a long coat that flapped against the wind, his face obscured by the shadows. His movements were slow, deliberate, too calm. Charlotte's pulse quickened. They were being watched. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He was aware now. He slid his hand beneath his jacket, his fingers wrapping around the handle of the knife tucked at his waist. The grip was tight, but his gaze remained fixed on the man. Charlotte, still clutching Noah, was barely breathing, feeling the weight of every second that passed. Her hand instinctively gripped the fabric of her jacket, ready to run at the first sign of trouble. They couldn't get caught, not now. The man in the long coat moved toward the front door of the station, but then he paused, glancing in their direction. Charlotte's stomach sank. He had seen them. Ethan didn't hesitate. He shot a quick glance at Charlotte, then moved swiftly. With a hard, calculated motion, he grabbed the man by the collar and slammed him into the nearest shelf, sending cans of soup and bottles crashing to the floor. The man grunted as he hit the shelves, but didn't go down. The store clerk froze, his eyes wide, but his hand hesitated over the phone, unsure whether to call the police or not. Ethan pinned the man against the shelves, his grip tight. The man was still trying to reach for something, but Ethan's knife was already in his hand, pressed against the man's throat in one fluid motion. The man froze, his eyes wide with realization. "Don't move," Ethan warned. His voice was low, controlled. "Tell anyone what happened, and I won't hesitate to leave you here." The man's lips trembled, but no words came out. He didn't make a sound, just nodded slightly, and Ethan stepped back, releasing his hold. The air was heavy, silent except for the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights above. Ethan gave Charlotte a sharp look. "Let's go," he said. Charlotte didn't need telling twice. She grabbed a basket from the counter and tossed in as many essentials as she could: bottled water, non-perishable snacks, a can of formula for Noah, whatever she could carry. The clerk remained silent, eyes flicking nervously to the broken shelf and back to them. Ethan, still gripping his knife, led the way to the counter. They dropped the money on the counter, enough to cover what they had taken, and before the clerk could say a word, they turned and walked briskly out the door. The storm outside was worse than they expected. Snow had turned into a full-blown blizzard, and the wind had picked up, making the world beyond the door a hazy white blur. Charlotte felt the weight of Noah's small body against her chest, the cold biting at her exposed skin, but she didn't slow down. Ethan climbed into the truck first, starting the engine without a word. Charlotte jumped in after him, the wind hitting her face like ice. She didn't even look back. The black SUV was still there, but no one had moved from inside. Ethan didn't waste any time. He slammed the truck into gear and floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching against the ice as they pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. The SUV followed them, staying just close enough to make sure they weren't getting away, but far enough to avoid suspicion. Charlotte's eyes were glued to the rearview mirror. She could see the headlights of the SUV cutting through the snow, but the distance between them was growing, just enough for her to breathe again. "We need to get to Monroe," Ethan muttered, his jaw tight. He was still focused on the road, but Charlotte could feel the urgency in his words. "If we don't, they'll catch up with us before we know it." Charlotte barely nodded, her mind racing. She had no idea who this Monroe was or if they could trust him, but they had no choice. The truck rumbled through the snow, leaving the gas station and whatever shadows had been lurking there behind. But Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The enemy wasn't just chasing them, they were always right behind. They'd been found. The truck lurched to a halt in front of the dilapidated barn, the tires crunching over the frozen ground. The barn stood like a forgotten relic, abandoned and weathered, its wooden walls sagging under the weight of time. The storm had worsened, turning the landscape into a stark, desolate white. Snow piled high around the structure, making it appear even more isolated from the world. Ethan cut the engine, the sudden silence feeling too loud after the hum of the truck. He glanced at Charlotte, his eyes shadowed with a mix of caution and resolve. "This is it," he said, though there was little conviction in his voice. Charlotte didn't respond immediately. Her fingers still gripped Noah tightly, as if the small weight in her arms was the only thing anchoring her in this relentless nightmare. She gazed at the barn, uneasy. Something wasn't right. The air was too still, the quiet too perfect, like a trap waiting to snap shut. She pushed the door open, stepping out into the snow with Ethan following close behind. They didn't speak as they made their way toward the barn. The crunch of their footsteps was swallowed by the thick layer of snow that blanketed the ground. The barn's door creaked when Ethan pushed it open, the sound of rusted hinges scraping against the wood like a warning. Inside, the space was dark, the only light coming from a narrow gap in the walls where the snowstorm's weak light filtered in. The smell of damp wood and old hay filled the air. Charlotte stepped inside first, her boots sinking into the thick dust that had settled over everything. Nothing moved, but the emptiness, the abandoned air, it felt wrong. Ethan moved past her, his eyes scanning the shadows. The barn had clearly been deserted for years, but there were signs of recent activity, scuff marks in the dust, disturbed hay on the floor, and in the far corner something out of place. A broken chair, overturned. He knelt down, running his fingers through the debris. The unmistakable scent of fresh blood still lingered. His jaw clenched as he examined the scene. Charlotte moved closer, her gaze falling to the floor, her stomach twisting. She saw the telltale marks of a struggle, a trail of blood leading toward the back of the barn, the wall streaked with more marks. "He was here." Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper. The truth was too heavy to say aloud. Nathan Monroe, the man they had been hoping to find, the one who could help them disappear, wasn't coming. Ethan stood, wiping his hand on his pants, his eyes dark with frustration. Someone got to him first. Charlotte didn't speak, her mind racing. Who, and how much closer were they to finding them? Then, the sound of footsteps outside. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. The door to the barn had swung open, but she didn't hear it. Too quiet, too controlled. Someone was moving outside, following their trail. Ethan was already at the door, knife in hand, his expression hard. Charlotte's grip on Noah tightened. She wanted to run, to flee, but she knew better. They couldn't outrun what was coming. Ethan motioned for her to stay low, and they moved toward the back of the barn, taking cover behind the old wooden beams. The snow outside muffled the sound of footsteps, but they were close, too close. Charlotte held her breath, trying to ignore the pounding of her heart in her chest. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. They weren't alone. Then, the voice came low, commanding, cutting through the stillness. "Put the child down, now." The words sent a chill through Charlotte. She tensed, instinctively tightening her grip on Noah, her eyes wide in shock. The voice was familiar, but too distant for her to place it. The figure emerged from the shadows, a dark silhouette against the light outside. It was a man, tall, with sharp features and a coat that seemed to blend into the night. His eyes glinted with cold certainty as he took another step forward, his gaze fixed on Charlotte and Noah. "I said, put the child down." The voice was colder this time, more dangerous. Charlotte's breath hitched. She felt Ethan's presence beside her, a calmness that she tried to draw from, but the weight of the situation pressed down on her like an iron vice. She glanced at Ethan, whose jaw was tight. "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice shaking but defiant. The man didn't flinch. "Doesn't matter," he said, stepping closer. "What matters is that you're running out of time." Charlotte's heart pounded. This wasn't just a search for the baby anymore. This was a warning. They were closing in. Ethan took a slow, deliberate step forward, his hand still clutching the knife. His voice was low, controlled. "You're too late." The man's lips twisted into a thin smile. "Am I?" He wasn't alone. The shadows around them shifted, and Charlotte felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. More figures. They had been surrounded. She couldn't see them all yet, but she could feel the threat closing in. Ethan's eyes darted around, calculating. "We need to move, now!" Charlotte's stomach churned as the reality of their situation hit. They were trapped. No backup, no escape. Only the cold, the storm, and these strangers hunting them. "This is your last warning," the man said. He wasn't interested in talking. He was ready to end this, whatever it was. Ethan's gaze locked onto Charlotte's for a split second. It was time to run. The men were closing in. Their footsteps were steady and heavy, like a grim march toward an inevitable end. The storm outside had dimmed the light, and the barn's interior was swallowed by shadow, making every movement feel more claustrophobic, more desperate. Charlotte could hear the click of guns being readied, the subtle shift of metal in the air. Her heart hammered in her chest as she crouched low, clutching Noah against her, trying to keep his whimpers silent. The cold air stung her cheeks, but it wasn't the weather that chilled her. It was the weight of the situation. Ethan was already on his feet, standing between Charlotte and the approaching men, his body tense and poised for action. The grip on his knife was firm, but his eyes told a different story. He was calculating. Every second counted. He knew what was coming. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to move, to do something, but her body felt frozen. Every nerve was screaming for her to run, to escape with Noah, but the barn's exit was too far away. The walls were closing in. The men stopped just a few paces from Ethan. The leader of the group, a man with a hard jawline and cold eyes, stepped forward, his gun raised slightly. "This is your last chance. Hand over the baby." Ethan's voice was calm, low, but there was an edge to it. "You don't get to make the rules here." A slight movement caught Charlotte's eye. One of the men was reaching for his radio. It was a signal. It wouldn't be long before more would be here, and she knew it. The storm was their only ally, for now, but it wouldn't stop what was coming. She felt the weight of Noah's small body in her arms, the rhythm of his breathing, shallow but steady. He was still alive, still worth fighting for. Charlotte's grip tightened on him as her eyes flicked back to Ethan. She couldn't just watch him fight. She couldn't. She wouldn't. Her gaze landed on a rusted shovel leaning against the wall, half covered in dust and grime. It wasn't much, but it was something. Without thinking, she reached for it, her fingers closing around the handle, the metal cold against her skin. Ethan didn't notice. His focus was entirely on the men in front of him, his body poised like a lion ready to pounce. His knife was in hand, glinting in the dim light. waiting for the first strike. But Charlotte couldn't wait anymore. Without thinking, she swung the shovel. Hard. The rusted metal connected with one of the men's backs, knocking him off balance. He grunted, stumbling forward, his gun falling from his grip. The others turned in shock, the distraction enough to make them hesitate for just a fraction of a second. Ethan lunged at the man closest to him, his knife flashing as he disarmed the attacker with a quick, brutal move. "Move!" Ethan shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. Charlotte didn't hesitate this time. She pushed forward, her hands shaking but determined, her legs carrying her toward the barn's back door. They had a chance. They had to run. Ethan was right behind her, his movements quick despite the blood seeping through his side. They had no time to waste. The air was thick with tension, each step feeling like it might be their last. They made it outside, into the biting cold, the snow swirling around them like a curtain that hid the world from view. Ethan stumbled, his hand pressing against the side of his stomach, but he didn't stop. They kept moving, the crunch of their boots in the snow the only sound in the otherwise silent storm. Charlotte was barely aware of the cold anymore, too focused on getting as far away from the barn as possible. She could hear footsteps behind them, getting closer, but there was no time to look back. They had to run, had to keep moving forward. The truck was just ahead. Ethan barely reached it before he collapsed into the driver's seat, his body slumping against the wheel as he gasped for breath. Charlotte jumped in after him, slamming the door shut as the engine roared to life. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning as they pulled away from the barn. But the sound of the SUV's engine in the distance, that wasn't going to fade. The men would be on their trail again soon enough. Charlotte's heart raced as she glanced at Ethan. His face was pale, and his breathing was labored. His hand still gripped his side, but there was a grim determination in his eyes. "We need to get to Monroe," Ethan muttered between breaths, his voice hoarse. "We don't have much time." Charlotte nodded silently, holding Noah closer. The storm outside howled like a living thing, but inside the truck it was eerily quiet. They had escaped barely. But the road ahead was uncertain, and the enemies in pursuit weren't just hunting them, they were closing in fast. They were running out of options. The cabin was small and isolated, nestled deep in the heart of the forest. The outside world felt distant here, lost beneath the thick blanket of trees and swirling snow. From the outside, the cabin looked abandoned, just like every other structure they had passed. Its roof sagged under the weight of time, and the paint had long since faded to a dull gray. But inside, the air was still and warm, offering the faintest sense of security. Ethan collapsed into one of the worn chairs, his body stiff and his face pale. The blood from his wound had soaked through his shirt, but he didn't seem to care. Charlotte hurried to his side, her hands shaking as she grabbed a small first aid kit from her bag. She worked quickly, trying to stitch the wound in his side, her fingers fumbling. His blood was still warm, and the dark bruise forming around his abdomen made her stomach twist. "Hold still," she urged, pressing a clean cloth against the wound. Ethan winced, his jaw clenching, but he obeyed. His usual composure was cracking, the pain was too much to hide. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "We need to move, not much time left." Charlotte didn't reply immediately, focusing on her work. She knew what he meant. But as she finished wrapping his wound, she couldn't ignore the way his eyes lingered on her, like he was weighing something in his mind. "Ethan," she said softly, glancing up. "How bad is it? I can—" He shook his head, his voice rough. "It's just a scratch. Don't worry about me." Charlotte paused, her hands frozen in place. She had been caring for him, tending to his wounds, but there was something more in his tone, the way he had said it too quickly, too dismissive. It was as if he was trying to convince himself, not her. She studied his face for a moment longer. The truth was, she didn't know what to trust. She let out a slow breath and sat down opposite him. The weight of the moment hung between them, thick with unsaid words. "Ethan, who's this person you want to contact?" she asked, her voice steady. Ethan's eyes flicked to her, his gaze sharp. He sat up straighter, his mind already working through the next steps. "A man named Nathan Monroe. He was an ally of Blackwell's. If anyone can help us disappear, it's him." Charlotte tilted her head slightly. "What's the catch?" Ethan's lips tightened. "There's always a catch, but right now we have no other choice." The room fell silent. Charlotte felt a knot form in her stomach. No other choice. She didn't trust Monroe, but what choice did they have? She thought of Noah, of the future they were trying to carve out of nothing, and she knew Ethan was right. They had to reach Monroe, but something gnawed at her, something she couldn't ignore. "Why haven't you contacted him yet?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared at the floor, lost in his thoughts, his hands resting on his knees. His hesitation was palpable. "Ethan?" He looked up slowly, his eyes darkened with uncertainty. "Because I don't trust him." The words hung in the air. Charlotte's chest tightened. She didn't trust anyone anymore, but the reality of their situation forced her to look at things differently. If they couldn't trust Nathan Monroe, they were out of options. "I don't think you trust anyone," Charlotte said quietly. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I have to trust him now. He's all we've got." Charlotte sat back, her hands in her lap. It wasn't just Monroe he didn't trust, it was everyone. She could see it in his eyes. The guardedness, the reluctance. Ethan wasn't the kind of man who relied on others. He was a loner, used to keeping everyone at arm's length. But this time he didn't have that luxury. They needed help. But did he trust Monroe enough to put their lives in his hands? And what if it was another trap? She didn't say anything. She could feel the tension between them, an invisible barrier that she couldn't break through. She didn't trust Monroe either. But she wasn't sure she had a choice. "All right," she said finally, standing up. "Let's make the call." Ethan stood, wincing slightly as he straightened up. He reached for the burner phone in his bag, his fingers still a little unsteady. This wasn't just about finding Monroe anymore, it was about survival. Charlotte watched as he dialed the number, his jaw set, his expression unreadable. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice picked up on the other end. "This is Nathan Monroe." Ethan didn't waste time. "It's Calloway, we need to meet." There was a pause on the other end, then Monroe's voice came back, colder than before. "You have an hour. Be at the meeting spot in the woods, outside of town. I'll be there." The line went dead. Charlotte exhaled, her hands shaking slightly. "An hour?" Ethan's gaze softened for a moment, though his face remained serious. "It's the best we can get." He walked toward the door, looking outside through the cracked window where the night had settled over the trees. The snowstorm was starting to die down, but the feeling of being hunted still hung in the air. The question was, could they trust Monroe, or were they walking right into another trap? Charlotte stood in place, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what she feared more, the unknown of Monroe or the certainty of the enemy that was always a step behind them. But one thing was clear. They were running out of options. The meeting spot was as desolate as they had imagined. The forest's edges were thick with dark trees, their shadows stretching long into the clearing where the black car had come to a stop. The soft whir of the wind through the branches was the only sound. It felt like the calm before a storm, too still, too quiet. And for Charlotte, it felt wrong. Ethan stopped the truck at the edge of the clearing, the engine sputtering into silence. The headlights from the truck cut through the night, casting long shadows across the snow. She glanced at him, but his face was unreadable. "Ready?" Ethan asked, his voice low, though his tone was more a command than a question. Charlotte didn't answer right away. Was she ready? Ready for whatever would come next? She tightened her grip around Noah, who was still stirring in her arms. His tiny face was peaceful, unaware of the danger that hung around them like a cloud. He was a constant reminder of why they were here. But did they have any more choices left? Ethan glanced at her, waiting for a response. His face was still, his eyes flicking between her and the car in front of them. She saw the question there. Do we trust him? Do we take the risk? The man in the black car had just stepped out. He was tall, impeccably dressed, his coat buttoned up against the cold. The faint streetlights from the distant city skyline cast a slight glow, making his figure almost ghostly in the distance. He moved with purpose, his footsteps slow but deliberate. Charlotte's heartbeat quickened. Was this Nathan Monroe? The man who could make everything disappear? Or the man who would trap them in an even darker corner? She held her breath, watching him as he walked closer. Noah let out a soft, delicate whimper. Charlotte shifted, trying to soothe him with a gentle, rocking motion. The weight of the decision pressed harder now. This was the moment. Ethan slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements precise, controlled. His fingers lingered on the door handle for just a moment longer than usual. Charlotte saw the brief hesitation, the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. It wasn't fear, it was something else. Trust, or the lack of it. "Charlotte," Ethan said, his voice quieter now, almost like he was talking to himself. "We don't have time." A siren, the wail cut through the night like a blade. Charlotte's heart stopped for a split second, an alarm. Her eyes widened, and she snapped her gaze back toward Ethan. He was already on his feet, moving quickly, his expression hardening. "We've been made." Charlotte opened her door, Noah still securely in her arms. She had only a moment to think, no time to question. This was happening now. They had a handful of seconds to make a decision that could very well determine whether they lived or died. Ethan was moving towards the back of the truck, pulling out a small duffel bag. The urgency was clear now, no time for small talk, no room for doubt. The siren blared louder, closer. They were coming. "Ethan," Charlotte said sharply, her voice cutting through the growing panic in her chest. "What now?" He paused, glancing at her over his shoulder, his eyes locked with hers. He was weighing his options, calculating everything in a matter of seconds. Charlotte could see the conflict on his face. He knew the stakes. "This is the risk we take." Ethan's voice was steady, though she could tell it was forced. His eyes softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at her and Noah, and then the resolve returned. He gripped his knife tighter in his hand. "We don't get another chance." Charlotte nodded. She didn't have time to question anymore. The alarm was growing louder. There was no other option left but to trust Nathan Monroe, or at least to see if he could truly help them disappear. The man in the black car was close now, and Charlotte could see his face, cold, calculating, but with something else there too, something familiar. Ethan moved quickly toward the figure, his pace deliberate. Charlotte followed, keeping Noah close to her chest, each step feeling heavier as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The world around them seemed to be closing in, the crunch of snow under their boots too loud against the backdrop of rising tension. The man stopped a few feet away from them, his expression unreadable, but his stance was firm, as if he had expected them. His eyes flicked to Noah and then back to Ethan. "Calloway," the man said, his voice smooth but heavy. "You made it." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He was still trying to read the situation, to figure out if this was really the lifeline they had been hoping for, or if they had just walked into another trap. Charlotte's stomach churned. She didn't trust this man, didn't trust anything about this situation. But the sirens were closing in. The time for decisions was slipping away. "Where's the deal, Monroe?" Ethan asked, his tone terse. "Are we wasting time, or are you going to help us?" Monroe didn't flinch, his face unreadable. He took a slow breath, then looked toward the road behind them. The sound of the sirens was growing louder. "Follow me," Monroe said, turning and heading towards the car. "Now, or it's over." Charlotte froze. Was this the moment where they walked into safety or into a trap? The weight of that question hung heavy in the air, the siren's wail building louder and closer. Her heart pounded. The man in the black car was already opening the door, and Ethan took a step forward. This was their only shot. Charlotte's breath caught as the decision was made for them. They had no other choice but to follow. The darkness, the unknown, and the chance for survival all blended together in that one moment. The door of the black car slammed shut as they climbed in. Time was running out. Charlotte's gut twisted. Was this the end? Or was the road still waiting for them? The black car sped through the winding roads, its tires kicking up patches of snow as it cut through the thick, silent forest. The cold air outside was biting, but inside, the atmosphere felt stifling. Charlotte sat in the back seat, her arms still tightly cradling Noah. Her body was frozen, not from the cold, but from the weight of the uncertainty pressing in on her. Ethan sat beside her, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. His earlier hesitation, the doubt that had flashed in his eyes back at the meeting point, seemed to have melted into the tense silence that now enveloped them. He had made the decision to trust Monroe, but Charlotte could still see the flickers of doubt in his expression, as though he was preparing for something worse. Beside the driver's seat, Monroe remained as stoic as ever. His face was difficult to read, a mask of cool composure. He hadn't spoken much since they'd climbed into the car, only offering a terse command to follow him, And now, as they drove further away from the meeting point, he kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a practiced ease. Charlotte could feel the tension hanging between them all, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. She couldn't trust Monroe entirely, but she had no other choice. She wasn't just running for her life anymore, she was running for Noah's future, and if Monroe could help them disappear, then she would have to rely on him, at least for now. "Where are we going?" Charlotte finally broke the silence, her voice a little too loud in the stillness of the car. She didn't want to ask, but the question was gnawing at her, and she needed an answer. Monroe didn't answer immediately, his gaze still fixed on the winding road ahead. He took a slow breath before responding. "A place far enough from anyone who might be looking for you. You'll be safe there for a while." Charlotte's fingers tightened around Noah. "For a while," she echoed, her voice rising slightly with the frustration that had been building inside her. "What does that mean? How long before the people chasing us find us again?" Monroe glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "I can't guarantee anything, but the place we're going, they won't find you there. At least not for a while." Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. Not for a while. That didn't sound like safety. It sounded like more time running, more time being hunted. But they had no other choice. She could feel Ethan's gaze on her, his tension radiating through the car, and she knew he was thinking the same thing. "Do you trust him?" she whispered to Ethan, her voice almost drowned by the hum of the engine. Ethan didn't answer right away. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting stiffly on his knees. "I don't trust anyone right now," he said at last, his voice low, but there was an edge to it that Charlotte didn't miss. "But we don't have the luxury of options. If Monroe can help us, we take it." Charlotte nodded, her heart sinking. They were running out of choices, out of time. If they didn't find some kind of refuge soon, it would all end in failure. The thought of being found again, of having Noah in danger once more, filled her with a dread she couldn't shake. The drive continued for what felt like hours. The landscape shifted, the roads narrowing and winding through dense forests that seemed to stretch on endlessly. It was eerily quiet outside, the only sounds the tires crunching against the snow and the occasional gust of wind howling through the trees. Inside the car, the tension between the three of them grew thicker with every passing mile. Charlotte found herself stealing glances at Monroe, trying to read him, but all she could see was his calm exterior. It felt like he knew something they didn't, and that unsettled her even more. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Monroe slowed the car and turned off the main road. The trees parted to reveal a narrow dirt path that led deeper into the woods. The headlights of the car illuminated a small, modest cabin hidden in the shadows of the trees. It looked deserted, quiet, and entirely out of place in the midst of such a cold and desolate landscape. "We're here," Monroe said, his voice soft but final. He didn't stop the car just yet, but turned to look at Charlotte and Ethan. "You'll stay here, lay low. I'll take care of the rest." Charlotte didn't respond right away. She just looked at the cabin. The walls were weathered, the windows covered in grime, and the place seemed completely abandoned, but there was something oddly comforting about it. It was secluded, hidden away from the rest of the world. It was quiet for now. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his face shadowed in the dim light. "What about you? How do we know we can trust you?" Monroe met his gaze without hesitation. "You don't. But if you want to stay alive, you'll have to trust me for now." He paused for a moment, his eyes flicking to Noah, who was still sleeping soundly in Charlotte's arms. "This is the best I can do. You'll be safe here." Charlotte glanced at Ethan, seeing the same uncertainty in his eyes. But they had no other choice, no more options. Ethan exhaled slowly, then nodded. "All right, we'll stay." Monroe turned the key, shutting the car off. The engine went quiet, and for a brief moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It felt like they had reached a crossroads, the kind where they would either find peace or descend further into the nightmare that had been chasing them for so long. "Let's go," Monroe said, his voice firm. He opened the door, stepping out into the cold night. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, looking out at the dark expanse before her. She felt the weight of the decision bearing down on her. She had no idea what was waiting for them inside the cabin, or how long it would take before the storm, the real storm, caught up with them. But as she took Noah's small hand in hers and stepped out of the car, she knew one thing. There was no turning back now. They were in this together, and whatever came next, they would face it one step at a time. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there, and stay tuned for the next part. In our upcoming video, we'll dive even deeper into the journey, exploring more twists and emotional moments. The story is far from over, and we can't wait to share the next chapter with you. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on the next adventure.